Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will continue our project to create our own web browser by adding support for borders to tables. This was our application at the end of the last video. Our Lite browser can now display a web page, and on that web page we have a number of objects, one of which is a table. And in the last video we set our browser up so that it could display multiple column tables. However, if we display this web page in a standard browser, we will see that it has a border around the table and a border around each of the columns. If we have a look at the source code, we will see the table tag has border equals 1. This instructs the browser to place borders around all the table objects. And this is the change we're going to make to our browser today to allow support for bordering of tables. What we see in this Chrome browser is the default standard for border equals 1. While this is the default, I don't really know of anyone who actually uses the default layout. They tend to use cascading style sheets or some other method for making the borders look a little tidier. So as we're designing our own browser, we have the ability to make our borders slightly different. We've already set some of the groundwork for this by working out how large our table is and how wide each column is. And this is what we're going to build on today. So let's have a look at our code. So our first task is to place a border around the entire table. And to make this easier, we're going to create a new user-defined type. And we're going to call this new user-defined type UDT object. This is going to contain two elements, long start and long end. Each of these elements is going to be a user-defined type on its own. The point user-defined type is inbuilt to PowerBasic and gives you an X and a Y long. These are very useful as coordinates, so we're going to use these objects to define the start and end X and Y coordinates of the object. So our first task today is to place a border around the table. So let's go into the function which actually draws our table out on the graphics control. And that function is displayTable. This function displays the table actually on the graphics control for the user to see. However, we're going to have to backtrack a bit back to the point where the table is actually constructed in the buildTable function. So far, we have been ignoring the border attribute. So we're going to go back to the render engine, the one that handles all the tags. This is the render HTML tags function. In this function, there is already a variable called attributes. This stores the attributes of each of our tags. If the border equals 1 attribute exists for the table tag, then that is when we will draw the border. So the attribute is already picked up for each of the tags in this line of code. So we merely have to pass that attribute on to the buildTable function. So down in this line of code, where we have the case statement for the table tag, we need to add an extra parameter to the call to buildTable. And this becomes the second parameter to this call. So at the start of our buildTable function, we have now added the new parameter, table attributes, as a string variable. Now that we've passed this on to this function, when we call displayTable, we can pass it on to that one. So at the bottom of the buildTable function is a call to displayTable, and we can add the table attributes parameter on to the end of the call to displayTable. And we're forcing that to lowercase just in case the user has defined our HTML with uppercase for the word border. So having added this new parameter, we can add to the beginning of the parameters of the displayTable function. So displayTable will now be aware of the table attributes. So now that we have this new parameter coming in, we'll have to add a few more variables to allow us to track where the boxes need to go for our borders. So here are our new variables. We have a table border variable. This will be a true or false to define whether the table has a border or not. I'm also creating a user-defined type called table, which we're going to use for the start and end locations of the table itself. And I'm making good use of this new user-defined type, UDT object, by creating a temporary storage for the position, and also another user-defined type to allow us to keep track of the vertical lines in the table. So if our table attributes have the words border equals 1, then we're setting the Boolean table border to true. We can use this as a test in the rest of this code to work out whether we need to draw borders or not. This line of code is the start of the for next loop, which draws each row of the data within the table. Prior to actually printing data to the control, we want to actually store the starting positions. This will be the starting positions of our table. Plus, I want to actually populate a new variable called rows for the last row number. So I'm using the prefix command to save a little typing and to make the code look a little tidier. So we're making the x coordinate of the start of our table equal to the current global x location plus the width of a character divided by 3. This gives us a small border. And the y-coordinate is the global y-coordinate of the position on the graphics control. And we're setting the rows equal to the upper bounding of strtable. And our for next loop can now quite easily go between 1 and the value held within the rows variable. So if we look further down the code where we get to the end row, the last row has now been printed on the graphics control. So we can now store the ending position of the table. And I'm going to comment out this graphic getPosition command. So we now know the starting and the end positions of our table. So we're now in a position where we can draw a box around the entire table. So we need to test the value of our table border variable. Is it true or false? If the value is true, then we know we have to draw a table border. So we're going to be using the graphics box command. This takes two sets of parameters. The first is the x and y coordinates of the top left-hand corner of the box. And the x and y coordinates of the bottom right-hand corner are the second set of variables. And as we have stored these in a user-defined type, they were available for use. So with this code in place, have we done enough to draw a border around the table itself? Let's run the application and see what we get. There is our browser. And if we drag our page onto it and scroll down, we have almost got the border around it. It's not quite there. It has the width of the table, but it's not quite got the height. We'll need to move our coordinates for the end of the table down by what looks like about half a character. So let's go back to the code. So after we print a completed line, we then get the graphics position. And in here, I think we need to advance these values very slightly. So let's try that code now. And if we drag in our page, and we can now see that the box now correctly borders the table in its entirety. And additionally, we have gained more vertical room between each of the rows, which will allow us to put horizontal lines in next. So just to make sure this will work for more than one table, let's put in a second table after the first, to ensure our coordinate system has not been affected. So we now have a new table added to our HTML document and some text after it to make sure we can still print text after the table. So we are quite correctly getting two tables printed with their borders. The data in the second table is slightly larger in its last row, therefore the table will be wider. And our code has handled that quite nicely. So now that we have the border around the table itself, I want to put horizontal lines after each row. So back to the code. On this line of code, where we have moved the position down by half a character, we're now ready to draw a horizontal line from one side of the table to the other. But first, we will need to test to see whether the border attribute has actually been set. And we will only need to draw horizontal lines for every row except the last one, because the last row will already have the border of the table itself. So we're testing the value of the table border variable to ensure that it is true. We are also testing to see that the row we are processing is not the final row. Then we can use the graphics line command. Again, like the graphics box, it takes two sets of coordinates. It takes the beginning and the ending coordinates. So we have the table start x coordinate, the current y coordinate minus the 1/3 step to handle our padding of a line, and our final one is the table width for the x coordinate, and the y coordinate is identical to the first one because we're drawing a horizontal line. So let's try that now. If we drag our page in, and there we have horizontal lines. So we're halfway there. Now comes the slightly trickier attempt to draw vertical lines, which will complete our columns. So back to the code once more. In this function, we're already storing the width of each of our columns. This is the maximum width that a column can be. So we'll want to draw our vertical lines in the table after each row has been printed. So if we go down to the line of code where we drew the box. So after our graphics box command, where we drew the box around the table, we can now step through each of the columns one at a time. So we're going to be using a for next loop from column 1 to the last column minus 1. We don't need to draw a vertical line for the last column because this has already been drawn by the border of the table itself. So we're going to use our vertical lines user-defined type to store this information. And we're setting an x and y coordinate to start the line and an x and y coordinate to end the line. So we know the x coordinate as the table start plus the width of our column, which is stored in the table columns array. And we're taking away from that the width of one character. This is to get away from the padding character we put at the beginning of each column. Otherwise the line would go beyond the edge of the table. And our y-coordinate is quite simply the y-coordinate of the start of the table itself. And for the end coordinate, it's the vertical lines along start. In other words, a duplicate of this first line. And table end is used as the end coordinate. And then we can quite easily use a graphics line command. This to draw our line from the x and y coordinate beginning to the x and y coordinate at the end. So if we try running our code now, and we drag in our page, we will see we now have vertical columns in place, based entirely on the width of the column, and the column width is based on the width of the text that it holds. So if we have a column which has more text in it, the column of course would be wider. So now that we've proved we can have a border around a table, can we have a table without a border, just to make sure we haven't made any errors in our code? So let's amend the HTML to add an extra table. Let's create a third table. and we'll give it border equals 0, and we'll change some of the values, and we will save that. So if we copy that one in and scroll down, we will see we now have 3 tables. The first table has the borders, the second table has borders, and the third table has the data correctly arranged, but no borders. So in summary, what we've achieved today is the ability to have borders around your tables. The table itself is bordered by a black thin line, and we have both vertical and horizontal lines within that table. Admittedly, this is not exactly the same as the standard HTML. However, I think it looks much tidier. There is of course a great deal more we can do with tables, however, we're going to leave that for another video. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.